Right, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our MP, our Labour MP, Kevan Jones, who's going to give a brief introduction.
Well, first of all, thanks, Veronica, for that. And can I say thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today. It's great to see such a good turnout. As Veronica said, these events, people have ideas, but actually I know putting them together, there's a lot of hard work goes into it. So can I say well done to all those that have actually put all the effort in to make today the success that it's going to be. Now, first of all, can I start by welcoming to North Durham those people who are not from the constituency, and to Stanley. Now, a lot of people, obviously, when I do school visits, a lot of kids say to me, what is politics? And politics has always seemed to be about, councils, Westminster, a lot of controversy, disagreements. What I always say to people, actually, politics is really about everyday life. And there's one thing that I found throughout being the Member of Parliament, not just for North Durham, but also when I was a councillor, is the people that actually lead in those communities are mainly women. You wouldn't think that by the media portrayal that is portrayed, but you go to any community group or any issue that arises in a community, it's women that are leading it. And I think it is important that events like this do focus on how we can actually make sure that not only that we can encourage women to get involved in the local communities, but more importantly, make sure that they get the rightful recognition that they have. I know later on you'll be, I think one of the presentations by, I see my good friend Dorothy Rand there, who's going to be talking about the long tradition in this constituency of women play an active part in politics. And that's not just party politics, that's about actually doing things in the community. And I think that tradition in this area is continued with the great work that is being done in the community, like PACT House. I'm glad to see our friends from Just for Women Centre have been supporting over since their inception. You can wake up, yeah, there, give us a wave there. A group that does fantastic work in the community. And again, was a group set up by women who just wanted to make a difference in the community. And can I say, since they've started, they are making a real difference, reaching some women who found themselves in very difficult circumstances in the community, who wouldn't otherwise get the help. And can I say, long continuing, they've certainly got my continued support from the initial meeting, I think, at the surgery, when two people came to see me and said, we've got an idea, how can we put it into practice? And great for them for putting it into practice. Now, have we made progress in this country? Yes, quite clearly we've made progress in terms of women's not representation in Parliament, but also at council level. I was one that was very keen to ensure that, for example, in the Labour Party, we got women only shortlists or make sure we got equal representation of women. And I think with the new county council we set up a few years ago, we've actually achieved that, got some fantastic young women of all ages who are making a real contribution to public life in this constituency. And have we made progress? Yeah, I think we have. And I always think, when I think have we made progress, think of my grandmother, who was a teacher. And when she became a teacher, she was what they call a student teacher. You didn't have to go to university in those days. What you did, you learnt on the job. And she did that till 1929. And people say, what happened in 1929? Well, what happened in 1929? She got married. And I've still got at home the letter from the North Derbyshire Education Authority congratulating Miss Cooper on her forthcoming marriage and sacking her, because in those days you couldn't be a married teacher. And the only thing that got her back into teaching was the Second World War, when obviously there was a shortage of men teaching. She got back into teaching. But can you imagine if that had continued, what a waste the next 30 odd years that she contributed to her local community as a primary school teacher would have been wasted. So that shows where have we got a long way to go? We've got other things to do? Yes, we have. The scandal still, since the 40 years plus now of equal pay legislation, we've still got the scandal which is there. And I think that is something which, we do need to continue to work on and ensure that that gender pay gap is closed. But I don't need to tell you that really it's about women, getting out there and actually taking action. And they do that. What do we need to do and say? We need to give recognition to those. And I think events like this are good. And can I just say a message to anybody who's not involved in their community or thinks that somehow, public life or getting involved is not for them? Well, it is. And making a difference, no matter how small in your community, helping people, making sure that women's voices are heard is important. And as I say, politics takes all sorts of forms. Making that difference at local level. You can make your community better and feel safer for women, or make advances to encourage people to fulfil the potential. That's what we should be about. And that's why I think events like this are great in trying to not only so you can network and actually get the experience from others that have done things, but obviously if we can light that spark in people's minds to actually put some effort or an idea that they want to take forward in their community, let's hope today's event can do that. So please enjoy today. I think it's not just a formal agenda, I think there's some very interesting topics to cover today. So with that, can I say well done again to everyone who's put the hard work into organising today, and have an enjoyable day, and thanks very much for the invitation.
Thanks very much to Kevan for that quite brilliant overview of the work that women do in the local community. We've got a very busy day ahead of us, and I repeat what Kevan said. I hope you enjoy it. And we're now going to introduce a very good example of women working in the community. This is Laura Daly, who is part of the Women's Banner Group that some of you may have heard of. Now, the Women's Banner Group was formed in November of 2017 from an idea that Laura, who is the Sedgefield CLP Women's Officer, she had this idea that she wanted to recognise and celebrate women in their activities in politics, in trade unions and in the community. So with the support of Lynn Gibson and other founding members, it quickly grew into the movement it is today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Laura Daly from the Women's Banner Group.
Wow. First of all, can I just say thank you so much for having us. I feel like I kind of shoehorned my way into this today. And it is wonderful to see so many people here, and actually a lot of people who were involved in the Banner Group as well. So hello, nice to see you again. As Veronica said, I think she said it all basically, I am the Sedgefield Women's Officer, but I'm not here with that hat on today. In actual fact, the Banner Group I specifically set out so it wasn't a political movement. Now it is, everything is, but that was in order to not put people off. We don't want it to be apolitical, we don't want it to be about one message, we want it to be about every message. So, as she said, I originally started this back in November 2017, and it was just a little idea. And I'm going to tell you as a little secret, if you can keep it for us. Actually, the idea came from a conversation I had with a man. It wasn't any man, though. It wasn't just any man. It was the amazing Stephen Guy, who you all, I'm sure many of you know, is really heavily involved, and his father certainly was involved in the Durham Miners Gala. And we were talking about, there was the lead up to it last year, and we were just talking about how amazing it is and how it's basically socialist Christmas, for me anyway. And I know there are some amazing female section banners, but there's never been a women's banner that has been affiliated to the Durham Miners Association. And Stephen Guy said, well, why not? And I said, I'm not actually sure. That should change. And so begun the journey that is the Women's Banner Group. I can't claim to have done it all myself. It was an idea, and I have to, if it's okay with her, invite my partner in crime, Lynn Gibson, up to say a few words as well, if you wouldn't mind, Lynn. I really couldn't have done this on my own. She's been absolutely instrumental. And I know she'd love to tell you a little bit about where we're going from here. So last year, as I say, we got community groups from around the region together to create This beautiful piece of work you can see behind me, 12 community groups worked together with Mary Turner, our quilter, to put that together. It was more than that though, it was about the coming together of different people. It was just getting people together to chat about what's important to them, what they care about, and offer each other a platform and some support. And that's really what it was all about. Because it sort of took off a lot more than I originally thought it was going to, we are now working on a lot more. We're going to be going forward and really using the platform we've got to do good things. And with that, I'd like to invite Lynn to speak about our future plans.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to move that down a bit because I'm a bit shorter than Laura. So, Laura's told you about what we've done this year. We got affiliated to the Durham Miners Association, which was mind-blowing, first ever all-women banner group to ever be affiliated to the Durham Miners Association. You can see our beautiful community banner behind what we had made this year for this year's big meeting. It was blessed in the cathedral. Moving forward, we've got a few projects that we're hoping all of you women in the room will get involved in. We are getting a silk banner made for next year's big meeting, which is going to involve a lot of fundraising. They're not cheap. So if anybody's got any suggestions for fundraising ideas, if you want to come along and help us support, I've got some flyers that I'll dot around the tables at break time. Sorry, I've got a really sore throat. And some more projects that I think should have been done a long time ago. Why it hasn't been done, I don't know. But blue plaques, there are not any blue plaques anywhere in County Durham that represent women. So this is another project that we want to take forward. We're looking for suggestions from the community to come forward to us, let us know who they would like to see represented on blue plaques, and it's something I'm going to be working with the council with. And another project, which we'll probably do next year, would be a female statue. Again, there's no female statues in County Durham, and it would be great to see a female statue erected somewhere in the county. That's pretty much it as far as what we want to do, but they are really, really big things. Another project that we it's been going on since International Women's Day on the 8th of March. We had a meeting in Red Hills where we collected names of women who inspired women. So we're still ongoing with that. We're asking people to send us in the name of a woman who has inspired you. It can be somebody local, someone national, international, and just write a short paragraph about why that woman has inspired you. And we're going to put them all together. We've had hundreds submitted already, and they're all going to go in a book. And Emily Thornbury MP has agreed to write the foreword for that book. So we're going to get that done later this year. Like I say, contact details are all on the flyers. So if you want to get in contact with us, we have a Facebook website, there's an email. Please do email me with your ideas of women that you'd like to see in the book. Some people have nominated the same person over and over again, and it's great to see recognition for women in politics and trade union and local community as well. And I'll hand you back to Laura to...
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I'll just finish up by saying we do have, we're starting a project to take the banner and the idea of the banner and working together around schools. We're going to be sort of putting workshops together from November. As Lynn said, there are flyers around with contact details on. We are putting the call out for teachers, for people who are interested in drama, for people who are interested in educating children, especially young girls, that they do have a voice that they can use, and it's important to teach them and the young boys that they are just as important and special as everybody else, and they do deserve to have their voices heard. So that is a project that's really close to my heart, and we are going to be rolling out next year. So we're going to be meeting in the beginning of November to start work on those workshops. Again, please do get in touch if you're interested at all, or if you do have anything that's just close to your heart that you do want to get a message across, please get in touch again. We really want to be the platform for women if we can be. And with that, I'll pass you back to Veronica. Again, thank you so much for letting us come and talk at you for a little bit. I hope you all have a fantastic day. It looks incredible. What an amazing lineup you've got. And thank you very much again.
Right, so thank you very much to Laura and to Lynn. It's a beautiful banner, absolutely gorgeous. If you can get a bit closer to have a look at it, it would be great. I'm now going to hand over to my co-chair, Janine Doherty, who will take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. My name's Janine. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at this conference today. I'm so thrilled that this is in Stanley, my hometown, and that we have so many really inspirational people. I'd like to introduce you to the Time Bandits, who describe themselves as historical interpreters. I'm very interested to see what that means, but through their work with investing in children, they work with schools and museums. So over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm getting married in 2 weeks to a very handsome Canadian. He was injured in the war and came here to England to recover. Well, thinking about it, without the war, I probably wouldn't have met him. I'd probably still be working at that awful butcher shop. My father, he came over from Ireland when he was 14 years old. He settled down in Ashwinning, where he still works as a miner, and where he met my mother. They have 11 children. I'm number 7. Yeah, I left school at 14 and started working as a general maid at that shop. And I vividly remember being down on my hands and knees, scrubbing the floor and thinking, if I ever get married, if I ever have children, I'll make sure they get a good education and a good job. When I was 17, I received my call-up papers and I had a choice, either join the armed forces or work in a munitions factory. I would have loved to join the army, but my mother wouldn't let me. So I started work in the factory at Aycliffe. It was hard work, long hours. When I had an early shift, I had to leave the house at 4:30 in the morning. And it was dangerous, obviously. Yeah, we had a few explosions, and a few young women lost their lives. Yeah, my friend Olive, she thinks young people are never frightened. They always think, well, nothing bad could ever happen to us today. We're young. I don't quite believe that. I'm quite often frightened. I can always tell the women who work in the dangerous part of the factory because their skin is yellow from contact with the powder. But still, all things considered, what counts for me, my wages went up from 7 shillings a week to £7 a week. That's not bad. And I must admit, I spent most of it on new clothes and shoes because I like my high heels and things like that. So can't help it. And I do like to go out a lot. I love going to the cinema. I love going dancing, and I love going to that ice rink in Durham. And that's where I met Harry. Wish me luck. Thank you.
I think you've just worked out what we do. We tell stories, true stories, stories about people's lives in this area. You'll be pleased to hear that Nancy was happily married for 54 years after that. I think the Canadian worked out. I'd like you to jump time periods for me. I'd like you to think about 1987 and about a group of women in Shotley Bridge. And I'd like you to pretend that my name is Mildred and that I can write poetry. Are we downhearted? No, not we folk. We are learning songs, we dance, we joke. Our social life has made advances. We are now invited to socials and dances. A Chinese meal has come our way for 35 secretaries with little pay, from one who shows a great compassion and feels we need a boost in ration. Yes, I know, but when you've got a newsletter to put together in a hurry, you take what you can get. Mildred, my mother, said to me, "What the hell do you know about striking? Medical secretaries don't strike. Medical secretaries in Shotley Bridge, in particular, do not strike." But that was exactly what we were about to do. Mama said, "Do you remember 7 months ago when they told us that if we applied individually for regrading, we would be able to make our case directly? Have you heard anything from them since? Because I haven't. We're sick of waiting. Without us, the consultants wouldn't be running their lists. No responsibility, they say. You've got to prove that you handle money or something like that. And as for actually running the lists, well, what are you talking about? Your consultant's always on the end of the line, or your line manager." There were 35 of us. Secret ballot? We didn't need one, as it turns out. We were unanimous. We came out and we stayed out for 3 months. It wasn't easy. We were on the grand wage of £75 a week. It doesn't let you save much. But we knew that we were arguing not just on our behalf, but for all of those other medical secretaries right across the country. 99% of us women. Wonder why we were so low paid. Might that have had something to do with it? We made sure that the health authority knew we were there. The first morning, we marched up the main street in Shotley Bridge, through the gates of the hospital and out the gate at the other side, accompanied by a couple of pipers. Shirley Sparks, one of the cleaners, came out to support us, waving a broom that she'd upended and stuck a banner on. And throughout the course of that dispute, people from the hospital and people from other unions turned up to offer moral support, companionship on the picket line, and cakes. My God, the number of cakes we got. It was wonderful. The Chinese meal was a donation from somebody who lived in the town and who thought that we had made a perfectly good case. Somebody who knew that without us looking through the medical records and saying, hang on a minute, she's waited long enough and her need is great enough and our understanding of her medical condition was good enough for us to say, time to schedule her. You don't mind, do you, mister? And Mr. of course always agreed because he knew who would get his life organised. That was the great irony. Do you know what they told us when we first raised the claim? The consultants are the ones who make the decisions. The consultants are the ones who are blocking you. It's amazing how many of those consultants turned out to know nothing at all about that. It was a scary time. Very few of us had been involved in the union, and none of us had any political background at all. The first time that we went to national conference and got up to speak, we crept away from the platform convinced that we'd made complete fools of ourselves. It wasn't until we sat down that we realized the standing ovation was for us. I'm particularly grateful to the Nalgo officer who trained us so well and who supported us through those 3 months. But I'm even more grateful to his wife, who effectively lost him for that time. I think she got him back, and I think she's pretty happy about it. He did a good job for us. And he did a good job for all of those other women. We had the pipers out again when we marched back 3 months later, having won our case. And the health authorities right around the country decided that there was absolutely no point in putting themselves through what the people at Shotley Bridge had endured, because we demonstrated just what was waiting for them if they tried to cross a group of women. I'd like to finish with another one of my poems. Here we are for all to see, your friends and mine and also me. It's not with joy this line we take, but all that's left our point to make. Consultants too have played their part. No names, no pack drill, but from our hearts. We all appreciate what it takes. Oh yes, then what about those cakes? Thank you. I'd like to introduce you to Jade now. a young woman who's heavily involved in the Decades project that I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about. She's bringing us bang up to date. What she's going to talk to you about is what young women in our area need to see happen today. And she's going to do it using a speech that she gave at a Durham conference earlier this year.
Hi, thank you very much for having us here today. So as Rosie said, I work with a company called Investing in Children who have been running the Decades Project in the North East. The Decades Project is a group of teenage girls who have come together to discover the heritage of women from the North East, and it's all around empowering young women from County Durham through education and through learning our heritage. Through this project, we have spoken to hundreds of young women from across County Durham. When asked the question of what do women contribute to your community, the most common answer we got back was having children and working in shops. Still in this day and age in 2018, teenage girls are not believing in County Durham that they can succeed and that they can get to wherever they want to be in life. Through the Decades Project, it's been shown that the only way to show that young women that they can achieve what they want to is through education, is through educating young girls about what other women in their communities have done, what other women in their communities have contributed to their lives. What we've done is we have come up with 14 different stories from women from County Durham who have inspired the young girls on this project to achieve what they want to. One of the main things that the project has shown is that through coming together and learning our heritage, women can achieve. There's a young girl called Rowan who, there's a young girl called Rowan who, when she first started this project, she would not even sit in the same room because of her level of social anxiety. Just knock it off on the side. It's the side. My phone, sorry. It's my phone. When this project started, Rowan wouldn't sit in the same room with the other girls because of her level of social anxiety. She couldn't talk to anybody really, only her very close friends. At the beginning of September, she moved to Carlisle to start university and doing her art degree. And it's through the Decades Project and learning about other women that had achieved, who had come from very, very similar position to what she had and still managed to achieve, that it showed her that she could also do it. And to go from someone who couldn't even sit in a room with more than 2 people that she already knew to move into a strange place where she knows absolutely nobody to do a degree that she really wants to do is absolutely amazing. And we need to do that with more girls. We need to do that with every single girl in County Durham to show them that they can be what they want to be, they can do what they want to do, and they can achieve more than having children and working in shops. The project, all the stories are going to be launched on the 26th of November. So if anyone would like to come along to the event that the young girls are putting on that have done this project, please just let me know and I will get your email addresses and send you an invitation out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, for the reminder of the work that we still need to do in order to make sure that our young people, particularly our young women, understand what they can achieve and we can raise their aspirations. Just on that, Jade's also reminded us that we need to switch our mobile phones onto silent, please, if we haven't already done so. Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today. Selina is from a family in Newcastle who've done an awful lot of good for public service. She's a professor of modern history at Oxford University. Her most recent book, The People, The Rise and Fall of the Working Class, which Jeremy Corbyn described as brilliant, has recently been published. She was educated at a local comprehensive school, and she's the president of the Socialist Education Association and advises shadow ministers on equality, education and social mobility. Please welcome Selina.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation. I'm really honoured to be here today. I've been already taking loads of photos of all the wonderful paraphernalia and costumes and so on to inspire my own students and colleagues. And I was asked to talk briefly about what's happened to women in Britain since some of us got the vote 100 years ago. And I wanted to start with that issue of the fact that only some women got the vote in 1918, because that's important, but I think as the very inspiring rally earlier made the point, that fight was a fight that many of us were involved in, including many Labour, socialist and working class feminist women. And I've been really struck over the last few months as the centenary has been commemorated that the media has really focused on this idea that only some women got the vote, only a tiny minority of women got the vote. United we stand, divided we fall. And it was a pleasure to see that rally this morning to remind us that that fight for the vote was something that came out of the trade union movement, the cooperative movement, socialism, the labour movement, quite as much as it came out of some of the networks that we've heard more about this year, such as middle-class women in universities. We need to remember that those very different groups stood together in that fight and won. And that's a really important victory. And I think we should give ourselves a round of applause and our movement a round of applause, because what happened 100 years ago was our victory, even if not all of our foremothers were immediately enfranchised by it. What that fight was about, winning the vote, was about being a citizen. And what Labour and socialist and cooperative women already understood was that that meant more than just putting a cross on the ballot box every 5 years, important though that right was. It was because of that belief that all women should be treated as citizens that the Cooperative Women's Guild and Labour women were at the forefront of pioneering mother and baby clinics in this country in the early years of the century. Without those groups, those organisations, those clinics would never have happened. They were instrumental too in fighting for single-sex wards for women in hospitals and in the workhouses that still shamefully existed into the 1930s to care for those who were too poor to care for themselves. And they did that because they recognised that in order to make women equal, society and the state had to take seriously spheres of life which until then had been treated as non-political. Community, as Kevan mentioned earlier, home, women's bodies, giving birth, the experience of and the potential to be mothers, childcare. These were issues which were simply not on the political agenda until the women in our movement got involved and put them there and demanded that they be taken seriously, and showed, often through using the funds and the energies of ordinary women in communities like this, many of whom hadn't had an education, that we were perfectly capable of organising these things ourselves, but that a civilised society would help us to do it for ourselves. And that's why they wanted the vote. The years after 1918, up to 1928, when Stanley Baldwin's Tory government finally granted women the vote, only because they knew that if they didn't, Labour would do it for them, were ones of massive parades in cities from Newcastle to London, of women combining to protest that all women, working class women included, should be given the vote on the same terms as men. That's not a part of our history that we ever hear very much about. They were also years of struggle. and never more so than in 1926 with the miners' lockout and the general strike, where women not only supported men in very important ways, but also as workers themselves took part in the general strike and took a stand to say democracy should be about more than simply electing our representatives. It should be allowing workers to negotiate on wages and working conditions. The 1920s and 1930s were also years when the Women in Our movement took a stand on poverty and infant mortality. The studies that they did, often working with educated university women alongside miners' wives, showing that women of all backgrounds could come together and work together for results, highlighted that at a time when Tory governments in the 1930s were arguing that progress was occurring, that austerity was almost over, that unemployment was going down, that in fact if you looked at women's lives and children's lives, you saw a very different picture, that poverty was still endemic, that it hit women most of all because they would deprive themselves for their families, and that infant mortality was on the increase. That some of those conclusions might give you a sense of déjà vu because shamefully, here in 2018, we are faced with a very similar situation, with infant mortality once again beginning to rise in the 6th richest country in the world. This was also a period in the 30s where domestic servants, the single largest group of workers in this country until 1939, increasingly voted with their feet and left for the factories, where they demanded the right to have their workers' women taken seriously, not only by the bosses, but by the male trade unionists, who at first thought that these were just threatening to men's jobs and should be paid the lowest wages. What they showed is that if you allow employers to pay women low wages, in the end, everybody suffers. And that if we're going to do anything as a workforce, we have to stand united. We're often told that women are apathetic, they're only interested in local issues, what's wrong with that, and that they're conservative. But it was that generation who came out of domestic service and went into the factories who voted Labour into government for the first time as a majority government on a landslide victory in 1945. And they did it in part because of Labour's commitment to the welfare state, which in turn was building on the work that those women researchers and activists had done in the 1930s that showed what needed to be done if we were going to put an end to high levels of infant mortality and poverty. Not only did those women vote for a welfare state, they were the ones who made it work. The two largest professions after 1945 became teaching and nursing, the majority of whom were women, working in the new secondary schools and the new hospitals under our NHS. Give people a little, they ask for a lot. That's why the Tories don't want to give us anything. We hear a heck of a lot about the need to raise women's aspirations, about the fact that children only achieve poor results because their mothers aren't looking after them properly from the Conservatives. It's never been true. The daughters of those nurses and teachers and those former domestic servants became the activists who set up the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, fighting for even more equality. Again, it's a history that's often misrepresented as being a few university-educated women down in London. The reverse is true. There were groups in Newcastle, in County Durham, across the country, and the things they were fighting for were bread and butter issues. One of them was nursery provision. Despite all the improvements that the welfare state made after 1945, the number of nursery places didn't go up in Britain between the 1930s and the 1970s. Only in the late 70s did they begin to increase because of the work of those local feminist groups, many of whom included trade unionists, who said, right, we're going to set up our own nurseries, we're going to demand training for our workers so that our children are looked after by trained childcare specialists, and we're going to demand that local government takes this seriously and begins funding nursery provision for our kids. And they did it. Another cause that was very close to their hearts was setting up the first women's refuges in the UK. Again, throughout the country. This was an issue that came close to being a taboo still in the 1970s, violence against women. Let's not forget that until 1992, rape within marriage was legal in this country. Setting up women's refuges was not only pioneering, it was very brave. And without those feminist women, we wouldn't have them today. But we all know in this room that it is no triumphalist march towards progress. The fight for women's equality still goes on. We all know about 1984 to 85, the miners' strike, and the pivotal role that women played in that. What's less often talked about, although it's known very much in this room, I'm sure, is the hard work that women have done in all the years since then in keeping communities together and trying to reimagine a future after the decimation of places like County Durham due to Thatcher's cuts. More recently, women have been at the forefront of the kind of neoliberal cuts that have been affected across public services. In my own sector, universities, I've seen since the introduction of tuition fees, what we now know is statistically correct, that the single group of students who've been adversely affected and whose numbers have plummeted in university and further education provision are mature student women. Women who want to get an education, set a standard for their kids, maybe go and do something that they couldn't do when they were younger and are now prevented from doing it. We are still faced with unequal pension provision. Women's refuges are on the front line of public spending cuts. And single-sex spaces, including single-sex toilets in schools, are being cut for the same reason, at the very time that we're beginning to know more about how period poverty impacts on teenage girls. Proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act propose to threaten single-sex spaces, and I would urge everybody, because the government consultation on those changes has now extended its date to Monday, to fill in that consultation this weekend. And care work, which employs such a large proportion of women, needs to be valued. I often am asked to talk about social mobility and raising aspirations, and I always say, you know, it's the politicians who have to raise their aspirations. Why do we believe that in a society which is ageing, it is okay to pay care workers so much less than bankers? What message is that giving our kids about where we place care for each other in our value system? But I think that there's room for a lot of hope. We have leaders who listen, and I'm thinking about Jeremy Corbyn and I'm thinking about John McDonnell. They believe in equality, and that is vital for women's fight, because saying, as politicians have so often said in the past, well, we could maybe get you a little bit more, it doesn't make sense if you're 52% of the population. We can't do with a little bit more. We have to be equal, not just for ourselves, but to show our daughters what they can do as well. But we can't leave it up to the leaders. As our history shows, we've only ever got anywhere when we've stood united and tried to do it for ourselves. And wow, what a lot we've done. Whenever we feel downhearted, let's think back to those women in 1918. They didn't know they were going to win the vote. They had to work for decades. Some of them gave their lives to this struggle. And in 1918, it was only partially over. They had to fight for another 10 years to get all women the vote. And let's think too about those women who voted Labour in 1945 and then made the welfare state and the NHS what it became. No other country had ever had a welfare state like that, let alone tried to build one straight after a devastating war. They did not know, on the basis of experience anywhere else, that it could be done. Uneducated, apathetic, we're told. They were brave, they were imaginative, they were bold enough to say, not only can we do it here, we have to do it better, we have to do it here to build a better future for everybody. If they could do it then, we sure as hell can do it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selina. That was wonderful. We have got time for a few questions. So myself and my co-chair, Veronica, each have a microphone. And what we're going to do is we're going to alternate between choosing questioners. So we, when one person's asking, the other person will be looking for someone to ask a question. So Who would like to go first? Oh, come on.
Oh, come on.
Right. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Eileen McKnight-Smith, North Durham Women's Labour Forum. I would like to ask, what is your take on women's only shortlists?
I think that women's only shortlists are a great idea. They came out of experience and evidence, and to my mind, that's the best way to make policy. Labour committed to it because they could see that women were not getting onto shortlists, and I think it's a terrific idea. One of the things that slightly worries me is that I've heard from more than one constituency Labour Party that there's a sense that over the last 5 years or so, some constituencies are seeing maybe 50-50 in terms of women's representation. And so some people, sadly often the men, are saying, oh, our work here is done. It's never done. They've got to stay as women-only shortlists, because the problem is, while you're living in an unequal society, you do have to take these measures. And we, for a long time, had to rely on the representation of men, and it's going to be a long time before we have complete political equality. And I am always very suspicious of people who say, well, it's kind of got to 50-50, isn't that good enough? It's only got there because of women-only shortlists. They are not a barrier to anything. They've made opportunities happen, and I think we should keep them.
Hello, I'm Karen Brown from KBC Limited. The Equal Pay Act came out in 1976, and we still don't have equal pay. What can we do to get that to a better position?
Such a great question, and it shows us, doesn't it, the limits of legislation. And I think, in fairness, that was a period where, you know, a bit like when some women got the vote in 1918, and I'm sure I would have been one of the people who thought, oh, I'm just going to put my feet up for a little bit now, because surely part of the problem's solved. And I think in the 70s, what we saw was a really great faith on the part of voters, trade unionists, government, thinking this will really change things. I think we've learned from that. We do need the legislation. What then happened in the 80s and 90s was there became a political sort of rhetoric about, right now, attitudes need to shift. That's a heck of a big ask. You know, without any state intervention, there's a real problem there, because most employers will not pay equal wages unless they have to. We can see that with what happened with the minimum wage, where when the last Labour government introduced that, wages were uplifted as a result. Employers could afford it, but they didn't do it until the state said, we really need you to do this, and we're going to regulate you. So I think what we need to consider is better forms of regulation along the lines that John McDonnell is setting out, actually, where we work with employers, but also, and this is crucial, with trade unionists, to say, okay, within your workplace, how do we best implement equal pay? One of the big issues has very often been that people are told, well, you know, the women are not doing the same work as men. And that's why trade unionism is absolutely crucial. I touched very briefly on the fights in factories in the 1930s. If they'd lost those fights, we would have had 0 hours contracts decades before we did. That was exactly what they were fighting. And the fact is that if you don't have ordinary workers negotiating and being able to have some control over how work is valued, this will not change. So we need to make sure that trade unions are involved in wage and salary negotiation, that those negotiations have proper power, and that crucially women have very central representation in trade unions, so that we make sure that their work is being valued.
My question follows on from Eileen's about women's shortlists. And I would agree with you, women's shortlists get a lot more women candidates. However, there seems to be disproportionately amongst them a lot of middle-class women, a lot of women whose dads have been MPs, etc. How do we get working-class women to the fore?
It is such a crucial issue, isn't it? Because we need to make sure that women who've got a real diversity of life experience are getting into these positions. And what I'd say is, again, I'm a historian, so I always go back to the past. I would say we need to have a situation, and I think that the Democracy Review may have set up this situation for us to some extent, where women, like many of us in the room today, who have spent years being activists, are invited into senior echelons of the party to say, this is how we've done it locally. But also, if we look back decades and generations to how women managed to get involved, it's very often at local level around local issues. And I think that there's a real sense of dissonance at the moment about what's needed to be a local representative or locally involved in your Labour Party and what we need in Westminster. And I think that's changing. Kevan made the point that community is political, that the kind of bread and butter issues that we're all concerned about are political. Jeremy Corbyn has said that he wants to see a new style of leadership that's about listening, not about charisma and sound bites, which very often means a kind of machismo way of behaving that many women are uncomfortable with. So I think that we need to learn from that and think about changing politics. One of my problems with some of the leadership schemes and so on that Labour have introduced for women over the last few decades has been, it seems to all be about changing women and saying, oh yes, we'd like to have more working class women involved, but they need to present more like middle class women. They need to dress in a certain way. They need to speak in a certain way. They need to go on leadership programmes. Actually, these are women who've shaped the world in which we live, on whom the movement has been built. So I would like to see more consultation with local women's groups, and particularly in CLPs in which working class women are already involved, to say, what do you need and how do you think politics should look and how should our parliamentary party look? And what do you need in order to get you to go there? We don't need assertiveness training courses. I think we need listening courses for many of the men in our movement.
Hi, good morning. I'm Iju from the Diverse Women's Network. We work in County Durham. Just to say that, of course, in County Durham there hasn't been a long history of diversity, but it's catching up and it's growing very fast. And there's been, I suppose, for many decades, women from ethnic minority backgrounds who are sort of hidden in small towns and villages and who've been working quietly and in isolation. But there's also a history in the UK of ethnic minority women in trade unions, in the Labour Party. And for instance, Jayabin Desai from India, who was very instrumental in the campaign for equal rights, and also for equal rights for all workers. So it wasn't just for women, but for all workers. And so it's also trying to recognize that women, whether we from ethnic minorities, LGBT, women with disabilities, everybody's participated in County Durham in a silent way or very sort of a very out there way, being in the street and in trade unions, in the Labour Party. I think it's, with this conference, I know we're a bit of a minority here, and there were going to be other women to come and talk this morning and tell their stories. The Syrian refugee women who are now a very visible part of County Durham. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to come today. They were in a conference, performance yesterday at Durham Cathedral, so they've been very exhausted, a lot of preparation. But their voices, are slowly being heard. And I think it's in recognition that County Durham is changing very quickly, and we have to think broadly. We have to think about all women, young and older. We've got a lot of elders who we need to bring in and learn from. We've got a lot of young women who need to understand our struggles, the history of County Durham, of the UK, of the North East. The North East is changing. This is the fastest changing region in terms of demographics. There's a lot of new families coming. In County Durham, there's a lot of migration from the UK, from abroad, and people moving in and out. So we have to be kind of mindful that, we're getting we don't want to be isolated. We don't want to stay isolated from each other. And we need to reach out. And we don't want people to think that it's up to us to reach out to you. We've got to do that both ways. Mm-hmm. So I want to say that today, maybe we need to think about solidarity. We need to think outside boxes, reach out, and see the commonality of our struggle. And last weekend I was in a conference organized by the monitoring group, saying we don't talk about black community anymore. We have to talk about like-minded communities. That means we have to go beyond race and other things that divide us and look at common struggles, common campaigns. And anyway, that's my message for today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just absolutely endorse that and say that history is all of our history, right? You know that you mentioned the Grunwick dispute in the 1970s, and I always think it's so crucial because it was led by Asian migrant women who brought together white trade unionists, black and brown trade unionists, and it was really threatening as a dispute. And it's no surprise to me that the government so quickly wanted to clamp down on that particular dispute, which we hear very little about now, because it showed that, as you said, solidarity can really win us results. And to me, one of the ways that we can do that, as you said, is to remind each other and remind the people out there that migrant women, that lesbians, groups who are still really ignored by policymakers and by historians and by the media, aren't marginalised groups, but have always been really central to our movement and to our fight.
Hello.
Oh, shall I go next? Oh, sorry, yes. Okay, I can wait all day. I'm Yvonne, and I actually live in Prado, so I'm pleased to be involved in this event today. I just want to, before I ask my question, you were talking about women being involved in local politics and the community. And my view is that there needs to be a serious change to the way that councils are run, particularly at parish level, where there is no support, there's no officers who can help people, and there's very little opportunity to actually do what people want to do, which is to make their community better. Very often they get bogged down in the infighting and everything that goes on around a political table. But my question is, going back to the trade union movement, I mean, everybody in this room is passionate and has been active in their trade union movement, I'm sure. But it is a dying structure. There's so many employers now who for some, at least 10 years, have not welcomed the trade union movement. They try to get around it by introducing kind of workplace community groups and whatever, I can't remember what they call them now, which don't support workers' rights, which don't support the equality agenda. And I just wonder how on earth we can get the trade union movement back at the forefront of the workplace and at the forefront of political change, because I don't see it happening right now.
Yeah. In terms of your really interesting point about local democracy, I think that's so right. And what recent history shows us is when you start privatising services, democracy and accountability just go, don't they? And we're constantly told that the private sector is brought into healthcare and into schooling because somehow that makes them more accountable. But one of the lessons that I've learned from history is that women tend to get involved in politics and act as very good representatives for other women if they've been able to build up to that through having experience, say, as a school governor or a local councillor, or involvement in a group which is helping to run a local service, or being involved in a cooperative. And thinking about my own area of education, the introduction of academies has been absolutely appalling, because there's now no sense in which local schools are accountable. There's no sense in which parents are encouraged to be part of their schools in many academy chains. It's being left to private providers. So we do need to think about reinventing local democracy in a big way, and that's why I'm really cheered by Labour's commitment to end the privatisations, to work with PFIs to bring them back in the health sector, and also now in the education sector. In terms of trade unions, I agree that it has been dying, but I think that there are signs for hope. The group of workers who are most rapidly becoming unionised are part-time women workers, and that's been true for a long time, which I think, just like the story of the domestic servants going into the factories and being good trade unionists, it puts in the box the old myth that the only people who could be unionised were people who were in full-time skilled work. We know now that that's absolutely not true. And I think the disputes in recent weeks, led by groups like the Bakers Union with McDonald's workers, the collectivised disputes from people like the Uber drivers, has been really significant in showing how casualised workers can come together and do come together to fight. And so I think it's there that we look and we listen to how those workers are doing it. And the union movement does have to do that from time to time. In the early 1930s, the union movement was also dying. Anti-trade union legislation was passed in the 1920s. The old craft unions were dying as semi-skilled and unskilled workers went up in number and skilled workers were hit by massive unemployment. And it was those young women in the factories who said to the Transport and General Workers Union, you've got to reinvent yourselves. You know, if you want to survive, you've got to start representing us, and here's how to do it. So we should be out there talking to those young people who have very bravely struck over the last few weeks and celebrating them and learning from them, because I think that's how we rebuild the union movement. But the other thing is, we need to elect a Labour government, because John McDonnell has said he would repeal the anti-trade union legislation of the 1980s, and that is absolutely essential if we're going to get to the negotiating table with employers.
Hello, Laura Daly, Sedgefield, CLP. Again, sorry guys. Slight change of topic for me. I'm just really interested to learn what's your take on movements like the Me Too movement and the seemingly accepted culture of sexual harassment in the workplace. When we have world leaders like Donald Trump not listening to women, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it can make you feel really despairing, can't it? I think that I'm sure all of us in this room know sexual harassment has always been with us. It's just that we have better ways of counting it now. So in a way, the fact that there's more awareness of it is a great thing. It's absolutely appalling that these men are allowed to get away with the way that they behave. And, you know, I think to some extent it comes out of that model of leadership that I was criticising earlier. You know, the idea of the charismatic, presidential male leader who, you know, we don't really need democracy anymore, we just need me to tell it how it is. That never goes well. It never goes well. The point about democracy is it's meant to be representative democracy. They don't go to Westminster or to the White House and just stop representing. We pay their wages. But that connection between voters and leaders, I think, has been squandered by governments in recent decades through things like privatisation. And it has then allowed these kinds of idiots like Trump to appear and to be saying something different. One way of combating that is to try to find policies which offer hope for the future rather than scapegoating people, whether it's black people or women or Jews or whoever. And I think that's what's given us a lot of hope, many of us, with the current Labour leadership, who've been brave enough to say, yeah, you know, we need policies which are going to present hope rather than suggest that it's all the fault of some group. But in terms of the Me Too movement, in some ways it makes me extremely hopeful, but I think it's down to all of us now about where we take it forward. It's made me think a lot about the pioneering work that groups did in the 60s and 70s in setting up women's refuges, because what those feminist women were arguing in places like Newcastle and Durham, they were very often very ordinary working class women who were arguing from life experience and from the experience of their mothers and grandmothers, was to say those episodes of male violence are connected to a bigger problem, which is inequality of women in society generally. And I think the issue with Me Too is it could go one of two ways. It could say, shock horror, there's sexual harassment in certain workplaces, a bit like the thing about the sex equality pay gap. The idea of, there's some highly paid women at the BBC who are not being as highly paid as really, really highly paid men. In the end, it doesn't evoke anybody's sympathy really outside a very small group. I think our job as socialists and feminists is to say their fight is our fight, because actually sexual harassment is connected to a society which thinks that women are not worth very much. And so to me, it's connected to a state which says we're not going to pay care workers very much. We're going to undervalue you. And it's making those connections now that I think we can do as a political movement.
Hello, I'm Part1. I'm currently the Northern Region's Unison chair, but I'm also the chair of the TUC Women's Fora here in the Northern Region as well. I mean, it's interesting to hear what the things that people are saying in here, but can I just say that you're right, the movement for joining trade unions is predominantly women part-time workers, but low-paid part-time workers, and we mustn't forget that the majority of women who are working through different circumstances and that are in low-paid jobs to fit the circumstances that are going on at the time. But the other thing is the 0 hours contracts, because how does somebody, and I'm a big advocate of getting women into unions, because it's the only way our voice is going to be heard. And you only have to look in the history books, because when you go back and you look at it, people talk about the miners, the dockers and all that. But if you go back to the 1800s, you've got the matchstick girls who organised and were the first organised people to win a strike and win it against them. And women can, when we organise and we come together, we can do it. But my view is, how do we get more women and young people into unions? We've got the apprentice schemes. I work in the NHS. I've worked in there 40 odd years. But in there, I was going out to our young apprentices. They don't even know what a union is. The question I asked them all is, I said to them all in a meeting, where do you think your 4 weeks holiday came from? The government. My employer. I went, you wouldn't have had any of them if you didn't have unions fighting for you. And yeah, you're quite right. And my question to you is, as a union activist and as a woman and belonging to the largest union with the biggest female membership, 83% of ours, but the majority of them are low-paid part-time women, is how do we get this out there, and how do I encourage more women? As the chair of both of them, I've built up unisons, and I'm now just started building up the TUC women. But how do we do that, as you quite rightly said, with the barriers that lie there for women? But unless the women go and remove them and start to speak of them barriers, so for everybody it's all part and parcel, everything links together. And for me, as I've just been saying here when you spoke so before, I'm where I am now. I don't have an academic learning history. I left school when I was 15. I was pregnant when I was 16. I got into nursing and that. But it's not about that. It's about what you believe in, to me. I mean, I'll be quite honest, I don't think I have the academic or the background or the knowledge to be an MP. And I really don't. And that's sad to say when I'm here. But when you go and apply, and I've spoken to these here for some of these positions and that, they're the first things to look at. They're the first things. It's not what you've done or what you do. So how do women from a working class background, and I mean women with real history on working class backgrounds, and I mean I see some people and they're going to me, but some people are representing, they've gone to public schools, they've got, this and that. And that's a heck of a different gap between how I was brought up in the Northeast to how some of these women have been. They've had them advantages. them advantages for them women are always going to be there against the working class woman. And them are the women that we have to battle with, besides the men as well. It's been proven time and time again. We don't only battle with the men, we battle with our own sex at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when I was at secondary school, ordinary comprehensive school in Newcastle in the 1980s, we were told about trade unions. You know, it was like it was part of what was then called personal and social education, and that has all been lost because now we are educating children in academy chains, which will allow their own staff to unionise, let alone teach the kids in their care about democracy and about that great unit of British democracy, the trade union movement. So it's not surprising to me that you're meeting young people who say that. I meet them all the time, and you know, it's interesting. A young woman said to me recently, if I could just have 2 days off in a row together, that would be really helpful because it would allow me to be able to plan childcare. And you know, I said to her, you know, the trade unions are the people who gave you the weekend. You know, do you know about the concept of the weekend? It's this crazy idea that you're just entitled to have 2 days a week at least off to do other things and not to have to think about work. But we've all got those stories, you know, I can see lots of nods in the room. I think that one thing that we can do is to make sure that we give those young people the education that sadly the school system, no criticism of the teachers because my God, they're trying to do a good job, but that the school leaders are often not giving them at the moment. So I do make it, you know, my business to make sure that every student in my care, when I say to them, what are you thinking about doing when you leave? Which trade union are you going to join? You know, any colleague who comes to me with a problem, have you spoken to the union yet? You're not a member? You want to sign up? It takes energy, that, and it particularly takes energy if you're in a workplace which is demonising trade unions. But I think it's a small thing, but sometimes, you know, it's the old cliche, isn't it? Acorns grow into trees. You know, we have to begin small sometimes. But it's, you know, and it's not just your job, it's all of our jobs. And maybe, you know, given what people are saying in the room, maybe that's one of the most crucial things that we can do right now, is to make sure that every person we meet, we make sure, are you signed up to a union? If not, why not? Trade union education, you were saying about feeling, you know, underqualified or whatever. I have to say I would totally disagree, and I'd just give you this name. David Cameron, hello, you know. So we don't need more people like him in Parliament. We need more people like you. But the point that you make is a really valid one, which is that we used to have other routes into adult education and trade union education. One of my great colleagues at Oxford until recently was history tutor at Ruskin College, the trade union college in Oxford, which is where my mum and dad met, so I literally owe it my life. And that's what gave them an education. When the state system, because we still had the 11+, which meant most people didn't get much of an education, it failed them. So those kinds of things are going. My great colleague is now at Oxford because Ruskin can no longer afford to offer a history course because of government cuts. So we need the National Education Service that the Labour government, that the Labour Party are talking about bringing in when they're in government, and we need to be campaigning for that locally and making sure that our leaders know that that's absolutely vital. That, you know, we really need that, and we need adult education to be a massive, massive part of that. The issue with qualifications versus experience, I completely agree, and you know, I think we see it all the time. And again, what I would suggest is that whenever we're in our community groups, our Labour Party meetings, whatever it is, we make sure that we're giving due attention to experience, and that, you know, we as individuals are calling out people who we think are saying, well, he seems impressive because, you know, he's got a Cambridge degree or whatever it is, and actually saying to people, what have you done? Where do you come from? You know, one of the reasons that I'm a feminist is that I think that there are huge inequalities between different groups of women, but I also think that there are things linked to us being women that bring us together, and sadly we're brought together by the experience over decades and generations of discrimination, precisely because of our sex, and I think probably largely because of our actual or potential experience of being mothers. And so to me, that's really crucial as an organising point. But that's all very nebulous, because in the end, we also have to say we can only do so much while we have this Tory government. And changing a government isn't everything. But at the end of the day, those barriers are going to be there until we get rid of things like 0 hours contracts and trade union, anti-trade union legislation. And to some extent, all we can do is keep reminding people who lose hope that it didn't used to be like that. We did used to have weekends. We did used to have strong trade unions. We can do that again.
Thank you very much. We're going to end the questions there, but we do have a saying that a woman's place is in her union. So when you're up having a look around the stalls, we've got a few trade unions represented. If you're not a member already, then have yourself a conversation with some of the people on those stalls. Isn't it wonderful that we have a strong, intelligent, articulate woman from this region who is respected as an academic at one of the most high prestigious organisations in this country? Thank you very much, Selina, for being with us today and answering all of our questions. Thank you for all of your contributions this morning. I must admit, you have brought us back onto time because we were running a little bit early. So we're going to break in a moment for lunch and a bit of a comfort break. Just so you're aware, you all have a box on your table with one of these maps. This is the map of where the workshops are going to be located. Each location has a letter. The letter corresponds to the list of workshops on the other side. I've also been told by Rose that they have the names of the workshop on the door. So we're going to have a break for now. Can I just thank again our panel this morning for coming to talk to us and say one quick thing about our MP, who is very modest and didn't acknowledge the fact that Kevan in the Labour Party and in local government is a strong advocate for women leaders and all women shortlists. So thank you, Kevan, and thank you for the work you do for our constituency. I hope you've all had a wonderful morning. Enjoy lunch, and we will see you promptly for the beginning of this afternoon session. Thank you.